Thank you so much, Jim. Take it away.
Well, good evening. It's good to be with you guys again. I think it's been about 6 months since last I spoke to the society. Before I get going, let me say a couple of things about where I work, and that's the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. We're one of 17 units of the Smithsonian Institution, but we're not downtown. We're south of Annapolis, about 20 minutes. Within the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which we call SERC, we have the Smithsonian Environmental Archaeology Laboratory, SEAL for short. And the folks who work for SEAL are members of the SEAL team. And they're all volunteers. We're an all-volunteer lab. It's fabulous. Every year when everybody else has to do budgets, we don't, because we neither take in money nor do we spend any appreciable amount of money. And everybody's welcome. Smithsonian, the environment at SERC, we do environmental research that informs government policy. It's a training ground for young scientists. And SEAL team is open to everybody. All of you folks have the opportunity to participate. And you're not just volunteers. At SEAL, you are the scientists. You help develop the research questions, the methods appropriate for answering those questions. You do the analysis, the write-up, and in many cases, presentations at local, regional, national, and even international archaeology meetings. So a number of our folks have given papers, including some around between the ages of 16 and 18. We've had several high school students, really remarkable young folks, and after their stint with us have gotten into the undergraduate schools of their choice, which include Duke University, William and Mary, Worcester Polytechnic, a number of others. We also have had a number of folks who finished their undergraduate degrees and haven't quite known where they were going to go from there. Didn't know what they want to do for a career, or knew what they wanted to do, but didn't know how to get there. And so they've worked on our team, again, individually or in small groups on research projects. And this is scientific research. This isn't sandbox archaeology. It's not something we make up. It's important work. And they've gone on to graduate school, all of them really. One has just submitted her doctoral dissertation at University of Glasgow. We've had two get their masters at UCLA, one at Boston, a couple at University of Maryland. We have another doctoral candidate at Maryland. So anyway, I mean, it's a great opportunity, but a lot of our folks are also older, retired. We've got some folks in their 30s, women coming back to the workforce after having children. We have folks in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. All of them participate, and they play the role of the scientist. So for anybody who doesn't mind making the trek down south of Annapolis, we're waiting for you with open arms. Okay, that said, I will talk about shells. So it didn't quite work, did it?
I think you want to click on the little icon that looks sort of like an old-timey projector screen.
I did, but the one at the bottom didn't work. So let me try this. There we go. Okay.
There we are. Good. Thanks.
That's unusual. The one at the bottom usually works. Anyway, so yeah, the subject is shell button making. Let me begin by saying that shell button cutting, making of buttons out of shell of various sorts of mostly marine, but also freshwater shells, goes back millennia, well, maybe not millennia, but centuries, and occurred all over the place. I have colleagues up in central New York who have found button cutting waste on sites that are nowhere near, certainly any marine waters, any oceans. But we're looking at an industry, we're looking at kind of mass production of these things. And it really starts on the Delmarva Peninsula around 1930. It's really the Depression years, and ends pretty much by 1990, by which time there was only one guy left doing this that we know of. So I don't have too many text slides, but mostly it's images. But I want to make a couple of points first. Manufacturing shell buttons on an industrial scale really starts in the upper Midwestern US in the 1890s. And what these folks are doing is they're harvesting yellow sandshell mussels, pretty much from the Mississippi River and its tributaries. And from that, making the buttons. The problem is what they used to do is they open up the shells, they remove the meat, and throw it back in the water, as well as all kinds of other detritus. As a result, they polluted the water and killed off a lot of the populations that supplied them with shell. The Chesapeake and Delaware bays have very little in the way of shellfish that are appropriate for making shell buttons. Hard shell clams, particularly the quahaug, would be one, and knobbed whelk would be another. The material is suitable, but the geometry is very difficult to work with. The quahogs are very small. The whelks have an almost spherical geometry. That makes it very hard to mass produce buttons from those things. So with that said, here's some of the species we have to work with in this region. Again, we have quahog. I'm not sure what people in around the Chesapeake call them, but I'm from Long Island. I used to dig shellfish for a living, and we call them quahogs. That was my major product. Atlantic rib mussel, which we get around here, the shell is too thin. It's totally unsuitable. Your run-of-the-mill oyster shells, absolutely unsuited to shell button making. But the knobbed whelk, again, is like the quahog. It has good material. It has what's called a very nice little nacre, N-A-C-R-E, a very lustrous type material. But behind it is really dense shell. With oyster, it's a laminar type structure. And so if you try to cut button blanks out of it, it just delaminates, it splits up. And the mussel, again, is way too thin.
Question, Jim, in the chat, are pearl mussels in the Susquehanna watershed not good for buttons?
We don't get pearl oysters in the Chesapeake Susquehanna watershed. We do get, there used to be certain kinds of mussels that have largely been extirpated. I'm thinking of Elliptio lanceolata. I'm afraid I don't remember the vulgar name for it. But we really just don't have the kinds of bivalves that are appropriate for make good material for this kind of work. I'll show you where we do have good material. If I can advance this thing. It's not behaving today. There we go. Well, I mean, here's an example of a hard shell clam. These aren't quahog, but you could see they not only drilled blanks out, but you could see one, they didn't even finish. But you can't get too many buttons out of a shell this size. And so it's hard to mass produce these things. The way they cut them out is they're not using a drill, they're using a tubular saw. So think of a little piece of copper tubing with teeth on one end, and that's affixed to a lathe. So that's how they cut out these discs or plugs. But here's the kind of material we do see. Yellow sand shell, again, from pretty much the Mississippi River Valley. Pearl oyster, and the picture doesn't do it justice. Pearl oysters, some of those shells could be 8, 12 inches long, 6 inches wide, and they're relatively flat. And you'll see in some subsequent images, you can get a lot of buttons out of these very quickly. Conus top shells have that porcelainous material, but as you can see from the geometry, it's hard to cut a lot of button blanks out of that, and even more so with tooth top shells, because they've got those little knobs there that make things difficult. Black abalone, particularly off the coast of Southern California, was a suitable material. those populations are very much in danger from overharvesting. So here's several images of these shells. This is the shell waste after it's been cut. I don't know how well you could see my cursor, but towards the upper left hand, that's a yellow sandshell.
We can see it fine.
Okay, great. So you could see all these plugs cut out of it. What's harder to see is that this shell is fairly thick. So not only can you cut out a plug, but you can then split that plug into 2, 3, 4 button blanks. In the upper right-hand corner is a pearl oyster, probably from around Fiji. And like I said, these things could be almost a foot in length and a half foot or more wide, and they're relatively flat. You can cut a huge number of blanks out of these things. And again, the shell is very thick. So you can take each plug and split it into 4, 5, 6 buttons. We have in the lower left, it's that's cone top shell. And you can see these are very clear cuts here. Here's a pearl oyster, a part of it. And each of those buttons are probably a little under, well, about 3/8 of an inch in diameter, I'd say. I can't quite see my scale there. But you could see how well they've used that material. They've gotten pretty much as much out of it as they could, and very, very quickly. There are some big shops that operated particularly on the Eastern Shore. Lippincott Factory in Milton, Delaware is one example. And Lippincott had, I think, about 100 employees at one time. As you could tell from looking at the picture, they're mostly men in that shop. But we're beginning to find that these shops also hired women, but the women focused more on sorting shell by quality, perhaps dyeing the shells different colors. Doing that kind of work rather than the actual cutting. These guys are referred to as cutters. Each of them has their own machine. It's like a lathe, but again, it has a circular saw as a tip rather than a drill or anything like that. And you might notice too, with this fella here, there's this little white thing sticking out. There's a lamp above, giving them lots of light, but there's this white tube here. That's part of a vacuum system. And because this, it's creating a lot of dust. So as these guys are cutting, the dust is sucked up into that vacuum system and removed to some sort of exterior container. The dust would be used. Recently, I heard just Sunday, I was talking to some folks about this, and they said they used to use the shell dust to mark lines on the football and baseball fields. But it also is used as a food supplement for poultry because shell is largely calcium. And that makes for stronger eggshells, a better product. It also could be used for manuring the fields. You put lime down to buffer the acids in the soil. So there are various uses to the waste that comes from this process. And if you spend any time walking around places like Milford, Delaware, and Milton, Delaware, and Denton in Maryland, look carefully, you'll see driveways. I mean, they're probably paved with asphalt now, but around the edges, you will see shell button waste because folks would pave their driveways with shell button waste. So it had some value. This is the only large industrial shell operation building that I have seen so far. There may be more. This is in Denton, Maryland. Very modernist architecture, built about 1930, 1931, as I recall. See, it's got lots of windows because natural light is really important. It has been adaptively reused until very recently by Caroline County. I guess that's not Caroline County. I don't recall what Maryland County, but the county offices occupied this building. But last time I was by this past summer, it was empty, and there was a big sign saying for sale. So the history, the future of this place is very much in question. I suspect it's going to get bulldozed. This is our map. Again, remember, this is SEAL team. This is all volunteers doing this work. Few, if any of them, having prior archaeological experience. Well, we used total station mapping equipment to create the map you see on your left. It's got the footprint of the building. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. And you could see the stippled area here. These are all walls built around the yard on the side of the shop. At the base of the wall, especially over in this area down here, we found shells of several different species. None of them, it's not shell waste, none of them have been cut. But when we looked at the stuff, we figured these are all small shells. This is probably stuff that never made it to the cutter. It was simply tossed out because it was unsuited, it was too small to make good buttons. The top of the part of the wall, well, actually the entire wall, we're going to look at this part right up here, is in the picture in the lower right. You'll notice there's something cemented into the wall. It's these, our local knobbed whelks. These were used at Denton to make shell buttons. Again, it's not ideal material because of the geometry. It's very difficult to make a lot of buttons very quickly. But what they did was we go back here, what they did was they took the waste and cemented it into the top of the wall. You know how sometimes you see places, particularly in urban areas, where they got steel spikes coming out of the top of the wall or broken glass to discourage people from going over the wall? These guys used whelks. Perhaps more typical, more common on Eastern Shore were shell button cutting shops like this one here. This is just south of Milford, Delaware. I came upon it while doing some contractual archaeology work. We were doing some archaeological survey for the town because they were going to expand their sewer system and needed to put in pipes along the road. So we were doing shovel testing along the sides of the various roads to see if there are any archaeological sites that might be affected. I was in one part of the project area taking some pictures, and one of my guys, one of my crews were a little further down the road, and I get a call, Jim, I think we have a button shop. And sure enough, it was this, definitely a button shop. And just to make sure, I mean, it was outside the area we were supposed to be testing. But we expanded our testing area just a little bit illicitly, dug a couple of shovel test pits in front of it, and encountered thick deposits of shell button waste. So indeed, it is a shell button shop. And there are several of these we've already documented for the Eastern Shore. You'll notice it has a stove chimney, which means this building is heated, which means it was almost certainly used during colder weather. Whether or not it was used during warmer weather, we don't know. But we suspect a lot of these shops were used by farmers off season where they would cut buttons during the colder weather, when not engaged in agriculture. Just a elevation drawing of the building, part of our documentation. This is what came out of one shovel test pit. And a shovel test pit's about 1.5 feet in diameter. You know, they rarely go down more than 1 or 2 feet. But this is all pearl oyster from the South Pacific. No other species represented. Now, it's based on only 2 shovel test pits. We haven't conducted any excavations around the whole building. It may be that there are other deposits that with different species represented. But this is all we got out of the 2 we looked at. You could see this stuff has been, they really squeezed a lot of material out of this, out of these shells. You can even see why was they started to cut a button and decided not to do that. Shops like this are probably just cutting blanks. They're not doing anything else. And then they ship them up to New York City or Western Connecticut, where they're polished, they're dyed, the holes are drilled through, little facet you see on a lot of buttons, and where the holes are, they're in like a little depression. That also is done elsewhere. The bigger shops were probably doing everything. The smaller shops just cutting blanks. A similar shop on Elliott Island, which is off on the edge of nowhere, west of Vienna, Maryland, so going down towards Salisbury. It's out in the middle of a big swamp. The building itself has been converted into a hunting lodge. We were never able to get together with the owner, only his daughter-in-law, who encouraged him to talk to us. But what we wanted to do is go on his property, dig some holes, see if we could find where the waste is, and sample that waste. Why would we do that? We're really interested in what species these folks were using, because we have an hypothesis, and that's what we're testing. The hypothesis is that earlier shops were using the preferred yellow sandshell, which are relatively close to Mississippi Valley, and pearl oysters from the South Pacific, much further away, but better material, better for producing a lot. As those populations of shellfish were overexploited, later shops and later operations within older shops had to use less and less suitable material to make buttons. So we should be able to, as archaeologists, we should be able to document that. This is the shop that started it all for me. Years ago, a friend of mine living south of Harrington, Delaware, I was just visiting him, and he took me to this place, introduced me to the owner who bought the property with this already on it, and he let us inside. This is a 1940 button cutting shop, just for cutting, owned by the Parachek brothers, who were out of Western Connecticut. So they actually came down to Delaware to set up this shop. We brought the team out. It was 11 years before I got back to this site, because at the time I was just doing contract archaeology. I didn't have the resources to do this. About 10.5 years ago, we started the Citizen Science and Archaeology program at CERC. And after a year, we got enough people together. We got some interest. 4 of us went out there one really frigid January day, and we made a map of the site. You see the 2 shell waste piles. We sampled them. We went inside of, well, here's an example what the stuff looked like on the surface. Again, this is all pearl oyster shell. We went into the building, drew a floor plan. Each of those numbers represents a workstation. So there was enough, there were enough lathes in this shop to keep 14 people working. The dashed lines that you see is part of that vacuum system I mentioned in terms of Lippincott company. So it sucks out the dust to a container out here where it's emptied and used for other reasons. There's a basement under this thing where, among other things, there's a Westinghouse electric motor that runs everything. But there's also a series of essentially lockers with, sort of chicken wire lockers that individual workers kept their stuff. And in those lockers were a couple of these crates of teak or mahogany, some sort of expensive wood. I'm sorry, I don't remember. With Fiji painted on them. So we know these shells are from, they were shipped, and the shells were shipped from Fiji in these crates by way of New York. The wood is incredibly valuable. It's still sitting down there as far as I know. The electric motor is interesting because this whole industry really relied heavily on electric power. It's very hard to do this with water wheels or foot power or anything else. You really need electricity. And so these shops were coming online at the same time the rural electrification occurred under Franklin Roosevelt's administration. Come on. This is the interior of the shop. Oh, bugger that. Sorry about that. That's an old recorded slide. but it's full of all this material that was dumped and been dumped in there by the current owners. But you could see the individual machines are still in place. And there are these bins filled with shell button blanks. It looks like everybody went out to lunch one day and didn't come back. It's incredibly well preserved. Unfortunately, I suspect the current property owner, a rather elderly woman, is not going to be capable of maintaining it. And she's cut down the trees around it, so we don't have to worry about trees falling on it. But this thing is not really preserved. Here's one of these lathes that they used. So there'd be this tubular saw that would be attached to it. And with your right hand, you advance it using a lever. With your left hand, you hold the shell and you drive that tubular saw to the shell and right towards your hand. Probably wouldn't pass muster with OSHA today. And here's parts of the vacuum system. You can see it here, particulars is where the dust comes out. There's a little thing here you open up to let it out. All these machines are driven by an overhead pulley system, belt and pulleys, all tied into the electric motor. And now for something entirely different. This is another button cutting shop. This is just west of Denton in Caroline County. And it was a project, again, I was doing as a private contractor. Some developer was required to do archaeology. And so my crew went in, we did a surface collection, just looking at the surface. And in doing so, we found this stuff here. That's a cone top shell there. That's another cone top shell. Now, when you look at the stuff carefully, you could see where blanks have been cut out. The only other species we found out there was the knobbed whelk, local shellfish. So what we did was we mapped in every single piece we could find using a total station, create a map, and we collected all that material. And since nobody else wanted it, we were keeping it at CERC, where it's part of our research. But you can see all these little pin flags out here. They all mark shell finds, shell button cutting waste on the field. And by mapping that stuff, you could see we can actually develop clusters. We could see a cluster out in the field. It turns out, I realized this isn't. This is part of a house site on the property. This isn't where we found the shell button cutting waste, but you get the idea. We map individual finds, and then we can kind of draw an ellipsis around it saying, okay, this is where the site is. So on this map here, imposed on an aerial photograph, this is the shell button cutting waste here. It's a little bit over here. And over here is the farmstead that we know was there until the late 20th century, and even a cemetery down here. But there's no structural remains from this shop. The material is so concentrated, there has to have been a shop there. There's a little bit of architectural material, brick and nails. So there was a building there, and it was probably there for a very short period of time. I would guess during the late 1940s, early 1950s. These have not been cut, but these are examples of cone top shells. And the picture really doesn't do justice. This is really beautiful material, very colorful, and it's like porcelain. And so when you cut button blanks out of this material, it looks like you cut them out of glass, or you made them out of glass. But here's examples we picked up off the field. So you can see they just kind of work around, drilling pieces out. If they kept going, they would have gotten to this material here too, although it's probably getting too small there. And even cutting into the sides of the shell. So they tried to get as much as they could out of the individual shells, but again, this would have been pretty difficult to produce a lot of buttons very quickly. It's hard to recognize this, but these are whelks. These are local whelks. But you can see this wavy edge here. it's been in a plowed field for decades, so it's a little bit worn, but button blanks were cut from these as well. So you guys out of the way here. Okay. So here's a graph. And the Schwanda factory, which was that odd looking, that modern building in Denton. This is the distribution of species. So yellow sandshell, pearl oyster, a little bit of abalone, cone top, tooth top, which is very similar to cone top. There are no whelks in here because we didn't collect any whelks. They were all cemented into the wall. But whelks were present at the Schwanda factory as well. And that was operating between 1936, so pretty early on, through 1954. Actually, the interesting thing about the Schwanda factory is that Schwanda was located up in New York City. The city fathers of Denton actually went to New York during the Depression, begging this guy to set up an operation in Denton, and he finally did so. The community provided the land, built the roads around it, and this factory was in operation for almost 20 years. And the Mr. Schwanda was a big supporter of local hospitals, so it was a real boon to the community at a time when they really needed it. Anyway, getting back to the shell distributions, the Paracheck one, which is the one that has all the equipment in it, yellow sand shell, pearl oyster, none of these other species are represented there. The Denton factory, the one out in the field, only two species, cone top and whelk. And Edgington, which is that shop south of Milford, all we got is pearl oyster. But again, that could be a sampling problem. If we dug around the entire building, perhaps we might find evidence of additional species. But the data are not enough to help us to completely test our hypothesis. But you could see some patterns here. The Denton one out in the field, just two species and neither one of them well suited for the operation. So I think it was a small operation, a fairly late one, although we don't have any dates on it. And just wasn't in business for very long. The Edgington one, judging from the amount of pearl oyster there, it looks like they were there relatively early. We have land records and other data that suggests that it started in the 1930s. How much later, we don't know. But it was probably one of the earlier shops, as was the Paracheck shop, which was using those two preferred species, yellow sandshell and pearl oyster. So what we need to do is find more shops, collect more samples of the shell waste, and start filling out this graph some more and see if our hypothesis holds up. I'm not quite sure why I popped that in there, but certainly the Schwanda site in Denton, downtown Denton, was in operation. It was one of the longest operating one we've looked at so far. So they're getting, they're there early, they're getting the preferred species, and they're in business long enough where they're using less preferred material. Simultaneously, especially in Federalsburg and other places on the Eastern Shore, we get these factories that are making buttons, shell buttons, but they're shifting to a new material. I'll let you guess what that new material was. Plastics just took over the industry. During World War II, the technology for producing plastic accelerated, largely to meet wartime demand. If you've seen that movie, It's a Wonderful Life, with James Stewart, Donna Reed, 1948, I think it was made. There's a scene in there where James Stewart's high school buddy has become a wealthy guy, and he tries to sell James Stewart and Donna Reed on buying stock in plastics manufacture. And there's a scene in there where they're in a factory, a wartime factory, producing plastic cowlings for aircraft, you know, the plastic hoods. Once the war was over, we had all of this expanded capacity for material. And just as we did during the Civil War, we turned that capacity into developing and meeting consumer demand. So a lot of things that were made of bone and shell before World War II, after World War II, were increasingly made with plastics.
If I
And
could
that
just interrupt real quick, Jim, there's a question in the chat. What was Maryland's primary competition for this industry?
You know, we don't have a real good handle on that because the industry really started in Iowa, in a place called Muscatine, Iowa. That's where not only where all the shops were, but that's where they manufactured the machinery for making buttons. But there was a great deal of labor dissension, certainly by the 1920s. They were destroying local populations of yellow sandshell. And that seems to be about the time the industry moved to Delaware or Delmarva. And partly it may have been to escape labor problems because a lot of these shops were small shops that were separated from one another. So labor didn't have a chance to kind of get together and realize they had strength in numbers. It was made possible by rural electrification. But where else in the country they're making them, I don't have a good feel for. We know that shell buttons were also made abroad, particularly in Japan. And Japan was a major competitor prior to World War II. So much so that heavy tariffs were put on imported shell buttons. So it's something we need to explore more. Where else in the country were they making shell buttons? I know they were making them up in New York on Long Island. There were factories, Western Connecticut, but I don't have a good sense of the scale in each of these places.
What about Virginia's Eastern Shore? Any information on that?
No, we haven't worked our way down there yet, but I suspect they had shell button factories down there. We don't know of any big ones, but they're probably the smaller ones that I've shown you, that they're kind of all over the place, and there's not a really good record of these places. But we're working on it. I just got some information from a little town just north of Denton called Ridgely, where they had a sort of satellite operation from the Excelsior works in Federalsburg. So it was a big factory, but they had a small shop in Ridgely. And so just got some information Sunday. We're trying to work that into what we've been doing. But there's a lot of research. There have been 2 published papers from my shop so far on this, the only ones in archaeology that I'm aware of. And we'll be doing more. All of our projects are multi-generational. When one person brings it to a good stopping point, moves on, the next person or group takes it from there. So we'll be continuing with this for years to come. Yeah, one of the things we're just starting to work on now is, you may be aware that the 1950 census was just released last year. With the census, the manuscript returns by law were sequestered for 72 years because they assumed we'd only live 72 years. And so this private information wouldn't be divulged to anybody's harm. We have the 1930 census, but there are few, if any, shell button cutters in there. The industry hadn't started when the census was taken. We do have 1940 and 1950. And so what we're trying to do is go through the censuses for the Eastern Shore counties of Maryland and Delaware, and just collecting and putting into a database. Let me see if I cobbled this together. Doesn't actually look like in the census. I did a little snipping, cutting and pasting. You can see here, Edgington, Harry E. This is almost certainly the guy from Milford. Born in England, superintendent of the button shop. He also owned it. And then his son, Franklin, was a helper in the button shop. Clarence, I can't quite make out his last name. Button cutter, button shop. We've got these other folks here. Donald T. Steen, I guess it is. But you can see button cutter, button sorter. Without even looking to the left of the screen, I see button sorter. It's almost certainly a woman. Yes, it is. Irene, Donald's wife. Button cutter, got to be probably male. It looks like there were one or two women who were cutting, but mostly there were men. You can see we've got information on marital status, their age. I don't see race in this. I must have not snipped it, but we also have whether they're white or black. After going through several hundred of these, I think I've only seen 3 or 4 African Americans. So this is very much a white industry. African Americans are pretty much kept out of it. But we're compiling this data from these data from 1840 and 1940, 1950. And once we get it in a large database, we can start looking for patterns. You know, what kind of folks worked here? Were they all, you know, middle-aged white men? How many young folks? I noticed already that there are a couple of divorced women who are working in these factories for that period. That's kind of interesting. So there's a lot of data to collect without even doing any field work.
Do we have any data, Jim, about how much these folks were paid? Like how much were the button cutters paid?
We do, because with the 1950 census, I'm not sure if this is true of 1940 census, but within the census, there's a sample. So like every 10th line or whatever, they have additional data at the bottom of the sheet, and there it tells you how many hours a week they worked just prior to the census taker, census marshal being there, how many weeks they worked the previous year, and how much they were paid the previous year. So there is a little information on pay. It's not as extensive as I would have hoped, but we have something to go by. And I'm guessing we'll also find some industry data that will also give us a sense of how much folks are paid. In terms of the census does tell us about occupation a lot, but not always. A lot of them are blank. Assistant foreman, assistant factory manager. I don't know what the difference between those two are. Bookkeeper, clerk, cutter is important. A lot of them just say factory, which doesn't really tell us anything what they're doing there. We have female supervisors as well as male supervisors. This is definitely, it appears to be how it's spelled, Frazier. I haven't figured out what that is yet. Machinist, manager, office manager, polisher. So we have different sorts of tasks here, and we can separate them by sex. I mean, here we have sorter, 6 sorters in these factories, and they're all women. And this is the same data, but just for the one Excelsior factory. So most of a lot of these folks in the 1940 census that we've looked at so far anyway, worked at one factory. And we have the same thing for 1950. In fact, the numbers look virtually identical. What's interesting is we thought it was a male-dominated field, but for 1950, 108 women, 114 men. If we go back up to 1940, 108 women, 113 men. It's pretty well equally divided between men and women. But I think that's because so far most of our data is from the larger factories. I think as we extend our census database out to more rural areas and get the smaller shops, I suspect we'll see more of a gender imbalance with a lot more men. But we won't see a lot of numbers because these are small shops. You know, they probably weren't used by more than a dozen people at any one time. Okay, so some of the observations we've made so far. We see after World War II a decline in the much larger factories. We see more of those medium-sized ones like I've shown you with roughly 16 people. I suspect mostly, if not exclusively, men. There's also a size shop that I have not been able to document. That one that we found out in the field in Denton might have been one of these one-person jobs. And what we know from at least a couple of documents is that when the big factories closed down, they had all this machinery. Well, that machinery was good for cutting shell buttons and not much else. So some individual cutters bought machines from the company and set up operations in their barn or shed attached to their barn. And one of the last people to work in this industry, a fellow named Preston, a very odd man, he was running just a small one-person operation. And a distributor, I met one of these guys, he met me out at one of the sites one day. A young guy, he's probably in his early 30s. He was still going around to these shops, or was until recently, delivering shells and picking up the shell button blanks and then shipping those up to New York. So he was going around to these one-person operations. Somebody may want to mute there. We hear your dog. And of course, with the data we have, it looks like there's an increasing variability in the species that were used, probably reaching its acme in the 1950s. And after that, a lot of these places start shutting down and really switching over to plastics. And it's more and more of a niche market where specific high-end clothing makers wanting specifically shell buttons, until we get really late in the 20th century in our last operation down Elliott Island, where he was making buttons for Barbie dolls and for sequins for Elvis Presley's performance costumes. Plastics really just take over. And so the industry has died. It lasted for a very short period of time, at least on an industrial scale. It extended back into the 1890s in the Midwest. In Europe, there was a long tradition of doing this work. We know they were doing it in Japan as well, but I don't have a good sense of what scale and for what years. So anyway, this is the kind of stuff we're doing right now. There are other research questions. It's not just about declining population, overexploitation of shellfish. We're looking at the effects of rural electrification. When the rural electrification program began in the 1930s across the United States, as part of Roosevelt's approach to dealing with the Depression, that kind of power source really freed industries like shell button cutting from water power. I mean, you could have still operated using steam power. Steam engines were certainly around. But electrification really simplified things and allowed you to put a shop almost anywhere. We see race and gender expressed, those sort of stereotypes in these factories. The few African Americans who worked in these shops, we don't know much about them, but I suspect they were, basically janitors. I think they were really kept out of the industry. And women had their place in industry, men had theirs. There's really a separation of sexes, probably with some exceptions. We see this as an adaptation to resource depletion. What happens when a particular preferred species is no longer available? Well, you do what we nowadays call, you are what we call today resilient, which is to say, instead of correcting the problem, you can find some way around it. And so what they did was they just opted for less and less optimal species for the process. Again, the quality of material was good, but the geometries were all wrong. And finally, and what I find is a particularly interesting question is, how does a community build and maintain an industry? A place like Delmarva, there weren't a whole lot of options. There's this really important economic industry, shell button making. But what happens to an industry and what happens to a community when they do not control the critical raw material? They can have all the factories they want, they can have the latest equipment, they can have trained people, but if they can't get the raw material, they're in trouble. In 1942, there was a problem. War was declared with Japan and Germany. A major source of shell was the South Pacific. We were not using a lot of shipping during World War II to move shells to make buttons. And that probably had a pronounced effect on what was fairly a young industry, at least on the Delmarva Peninsula. Now, this ramifies to other problems we deal with today. Think of Ocean City, Maryland. Their major economic engine is tourism, but they don't control the raw material, which is tourist. What do you do if tourists don't want to come to your tourist destination? It's the same sort of thing. You have a business erected around a critical material that you have no control over. So we're interested in looking at the anthropology of that, how these communities deal with that. Anyway, I think that's all I have. Well, we have a couple of references here. I can always put you guys in touch with the published articles on the subject if you're interested. You're also welcome to join us at SEAL and be a part of this and other research opportunities. So I think that's about all I have. I think I'm going to stop sharing. So if you have any questions, ask
There's
away.
a couple of questions that have come in the chat. Well, one of which is a version of a question that I think I may have asked poorly before. How much were they paid? I asked you if we knew how much they were paid. What did they make?
I did collect some figures recently from the census, and it wasn't very much. I think the salaries range for cutters, for most people, it was probably between maybe $600 and $2,500 a year. But without putting that into context, it's hard to make sense of that. I know when I was a kid, my dad worked in a factory. I think he made a maximum of $90 a week, in the early 60s. So you figure out what that comes to, let's say $100 a week, 52 weeks. So about $5,000 a year. And that would have been the early 1960s. So we need to provide some context. The nice thing about the censuses, though, is one thing we're learning going through these is that there were other industries on Delmarva. There was a fairly robust clothing manufacturing industry, which might be one of the reasons why shell button cutting played the place was so attractive for that industry. They were probably making a lot of fairly standard shell buttons for workaday clothing. And the buttons they were providing to the big clothing designers in New York, they were probably just shipping up as blanks, and they were finishing the buttons there, polishing them, dyeing them, drilling the holes, custom making them for the kinds of fashionable clothing they were producing each season. I should also note, because I forgot to say earlier, for the button cutters, they're being paid largely by weight. How many blanks, how many pounds of blanks. And it also depends on size, because the order might be for button blanks of 20 lines, L-I-G-N-E-S. And a line, buttons are measured in lines. There are 40 lines per inch. So you could do the math. So if you were doing a 20-line button, that's half an inch in diameter. So depending on the size you were supposed to be cutting, and there'd be a rate assigned to that weight, per pound. So that's how the cutters were being paid. But there are other folks, especially in the bigger factories, who are polishing and dyeing and doing all kinds of other things.
Got it. Two other questions. First of all, what's the relationship between wampum and shell buttons and the way they were made? And then the second question, who imported the shells for the button makers?
Let me handle the first one, the second question first. They're imported, I think, by the major companies up in New York. So they seem to be shipped to New York and then broken down into smaller quantities and sent out to different factories. And by 1930s, that's probably not even by train, that's by a truck, they're being trucked down. In terms of wampum, wampum is made from both the quahog and from whelks. And basically they're cutting that shell into, well, yeah, it's very similar, really. I must say. The process is simpler. It's hand done. There's no machinery involved, but it's the same sort of thing where you basically cut a piece of shell, hard porcelaneous shell. You polish it, and then you drill a hole through it because you have to string this stuff. And that was a bit of an industry in Manhattan, Western Connecticut area, as the Dutch were actually manufacturing wampum to trade to the Native Americans for beaver hides and stuff like that. And they were so effective at making because they were using steel tools. They weren't using stone tools and whatnot the way Native Americans traditionally had done so. They were able to flood the market very quickly. Wampum lost its value, partly because it was made on a larger scale, but partly because wampum isn't actually money, as most people think it is. It's who made the wampum and how it was strong and the relationships created by exchanging wampum. That's where the value came from. It's not by any sense of the word money in a European capitalist sense. So I hope I answered both those questions.
Thanks.
We had another one from, is that Dawn? I see a hand up. And
That was the who imported the shells.
oh, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and we do have a photograph from Fiji of these Fijians taking these shells and packing them into these wooden crates, this very expensive teak type wood, and printing Fiji on it. So we have a good connection.
Right. You mentioned that with yeah.
Any
Other questions, folks?
See a hand up with Jackie. Oh, that's mine. That's my mouse. Okay. Oh, sure. So I guess that's
agree.
it for this evening. Hopefully I'll see you guys again with some other talk. And it's good to see you all.